Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a Premier Field Engineer specializing in System Center Technologies. Today's discussion is part 3 in an ongoing series dealing with operating system deployment in Configuration Manager 2012. Today's topic specifically talks about task sequencing. So far, we have parts 1 and 2. Part 1 is a basic introduction of terms and some concepts important to understand OSD. Part 2 was a discussion of how we obtain the image file that we're going to deploy. Part 3 now turns the focus to the real centerpiece of OSD, which is task sequencing. So in this session, really that's all we're going to talk about is task sequencing. We're going to talk about it in a couple of ways. So there's the task sequence itself, which is the engine that drives a lot of the processes, but then there's a couple of wizards that work with the task sequences, either to engage the task sequences and allow them to run, or the media might be, the wizard might produce media that has an embedded task sequence, that kind of thing. So we'll look at those two items for sure, and then look at the elements of the task sequence, kind of walk through creating a basic task sequence and show what some of the elements are to actually get the image deployed that we created in the last session, and then at that point we'll wrap up. Right, that'll take us a decent amount of time. So that said, let's go ahead and get started. We'll spend the rest of our time in the lab. So let me pull that in. All right, so here's the lab, and we're focused in on the task sequence node for OSD. Okay, so on the task sequence node, if we right click, there are two options: either create a task sequence, which we'll do shortly, or create task sequence media. So task sequence media, we saw this screen last time briefly, and we used it to create capture media. So the media, ultimately all of the media will boot into Windows PE to do something, right? The standalone media, as the name implies, and we'll see later, and it's probably next session, is media that is all self-contained. Everything that we need for the process of imaging is in the standalone media. The idea of this is that imaging can be done completely disconnected from the network, right? In this standalone media, you'll have Windows PE, our boot media, plus all of the details for our task sequence that we need. Then we have bootable media, which we also created last time. And bootable media will, or at least we saw it last time, bootable media essentially is Windows PE that we launch from disk or USB stick or even Pixie, even though you don't see Pixie here. And we can leverage that to access the ConfigMgr environment and pull down task sequences or images that we want to deploy. The third we did see, the capture media. So the capture media, this one is one that actually has an embedded task sequence inside of it. The capture media has a specific purpose. It boots into Windows PE, starts in the running OS, so we can sysprep and such, then reboots, goes into Windows PE, and starts an embedded task sequence that is for the purpose of capturing that image. Right? That's really the only one here that has an embedded task sequence. Then we have pre-staged media, which is a little bit of an advanced concept we'll talk about, not this time, but in a future session. Okay? So that's media, just getting the different kinds of media created, some that just boot into PE, others that contain everything, some that are just, or one that is just for capture, has an embedded task sequence and such. What we want to do is we've captured our Windows 8, and this one, I can get rid of this one, but our Windows 8 image, the WIM file, we have it staged and we want to deploy that. So to deploy it, we create a task sequence that will do that. And there's several kinds of ways that you can create a task sequence. For example, you have the build and capture task sequence, which we showed last time. Then we have an install an image to a VHD, a virtual hard disk. That's, again, a little bit of an advanced concept we won't cover today. But you can build a task sequence that will do this. We'll talk about this in a later session. You can create a completely custom task sequence. I actually really prefer to create the totally custom task sequence because it allows you to put the building blocks in place that you need to do the job of imaging. But it's not a place to start. It's something that you're really wanting or ready to do once you understand how OSD works. So as a starting place, and even if you want to use this to get a few of the steps created for you to start with, you can use the top one, which is install an existing image package. That's what we'll do here. So we'll call it basic, just because it's just going to be the bare bones to deploy an operating system. And we have to specify a boot image. The boot image, again, is Windows PE. All of the imaging happens inside Windows PE, so we need to have a boot image assigned to every task sequence in order for the image to deploy. The question is, which one do we use? So here, this is just the plain vanilla install that you would have. You'll get by default an x86 and an x64 boot image. Oftentimes you'll have custom boot images. I don't have any here. So the question about which task or which boot image to associate with the task sequence really depends on the really mainly depends on the hardware type that you're imaging. If you're imaging a BIOS-based system, it really does not matter what boot image so much that you start with and then put here, right? Meaning that you could have a mismatch in operating system or in boot image. You could have your boot media or your Pixie, perhaps, right, come down with an x64 boot image, but you're really needing an x86 boot image for this task sequence. We adjust for that, and we'll figure that out and take the extra step to download the boot media that we need. But when you're assigning the boot media to your task sequence, it's a good idea to get in the habit of making sure that your platform boot media is aligned with the platform you'll be imaging. So if you're imaging a 64-bit OS, use a 64-bit boot image. If you're imaging x86, use an x86 boot image. Again, that is not such a big deal on BIOS-based systems, but it is a big deal on UEFI-based systems. So it's a good idea to get in the habit of doing it now, right? Okay, so we'll just choose x64 and move on. This does need to be on a distribution point so that we can leverage it whenever we come runtime, right? I'll show you that in a minute. Then we're going to install an image package. So these are the images. The image package name might suggest this, but it's not. It's over here. So it's Windows 8 Enterprise. We just saw it. I'll choose this. And then images, notice the 1-. It's possible, as we talked about last time, for a WIM to contain more than one image, more than one partition of data. So you might have a 1- and that's your main install, a 2- and that could be a data drive or something like that. All right, up to you. This one just has one, and it ultimately also depends on the system you're capturing from, whether it has the system partition in place, like would be the case with the default Windows 7 load, things like that, right? Okay, so we have just one, so we'll use that. Then we have a few choices here. We'll dig into some of these in more detail as we go into later sessions, but we'll talk about them here. So partition and format the target computer before installing the operating system. It's selected by default. Seems like a good idea, and it is oftentimes a good idea. However, there are places where partitioning the disk might not be the best idea, such as if you're using USMT hard linking. Now, again, we'll talk about that in a future session. Don't get tied up on that, but there are considerations where maybe you don't want to partition and format the drive ahead of time, right? Then we have configure the task sequence to use BitLocker. I'm going to turn that off here, but if I turned it on, it would include the steps in the task sequence that are necessary for configuring and running BitLocker during imaging. Right? Product key information, if you want to specify it, I don't. What you want to do with the administrator password, I'm just going to randomly assign it. That's the default. I would encourage you to think about this in production, because if you are imaging a system and something goes wrong and you have a randomly assigned administrator password, unless you have some other password that is on that system that allows you to get into it, you're stuck. So if I'm really doing this where I really care about being able to access the end system, if there's a problem, I always make sure I have a password configured for the administrator account. But again, you can do it a couple of different ways, just be aware of it. So next, now, whether I want to join a work group or a domain. Here I'm just going to join a work group. Just to get past this screen, I'll click W, And if I do decide to join a domain, though, no problem. I just need to give the credentials that are allowed to join the domain. Here, I have to specify a location for the Configuration Manager client files. This is a requirement. You cannot do imaging without having the Configuration Manager client as a part of the process. Now, let me pause for a minute, go over here to Application Management, because while this is a package, it's a unique package, meaning there are no programs, there are no deployments. We do have this content on distribution points, and that is required. I guess I don't. I thought I did. But anyway, it's required to have this client package on distribution points. Otherwise, your imaging will fail. Maybe, I might have recreated it a second time. Let's look at this one. Yeah, so I have this one on a distribution point. All right. And this is the one I'm using, Configuration Manager Client Package. Go back over here. We'll see Configuration Manager Client Package. I just duplicated it, right? And this installs the client. So the reason we create a shell package with no program, no deployment, is because really all we need to do is tell Config Manager where it can go get these files. We do that by specifying the source directory to the client files and then pushing this out to a distribution point so Config Manager can locate it, right? That's all we're doing. You can insert some installation properties here if you want to. Not every installation property is supported through OSD, but the key ones are. Then you choose how you want to handle state migration. So you can choose, if you want to capture user settings and files. If you choose to do that, you need another package that is pointing to the location of the user state migration tools, right? I'm not going to do that. You can also choose to capture network settings or can capture Windows settings if you like, right? The idea of this is you really care about capturing these things if you're starting the task sequence from within a running OS. Another way to say it is a non-bare metal install. In those cases, you might want to scrape off user state data. I'm not doing it here again because we're going to talk about that. It's a specific topic. We'll talk about that topic, talk about some details around it, and so we'll save that. You could also choose to capture your network settings and your adapter settings and your computer name and things like that. If you're doing bare metal, none of that really makes sense, but I'm going to include it here because I want to show you something in the task sequence. All right, now options to install updates. So I'm going to choose not to install any updates. We'll talk about that in a minute. Install applications. Again, I can choose to install applications, and then I'm done. So we've worked through the wizard. I'm going to go ahead and let it do its thing and finish up. So just a callback to the fact that this is a wizard. It is a shortcut to give you some key steps in building a task sequence. This by no means is a complete list of what you can do with the task sequence. It's by no means all you can do in terms of steps with a task sequence. It's basically a primer to get you rolling. Okay? So now that I've got this built, let's take a look at this task sequence. Let me go back down to task sequences. So one of the things that you'll have task sequences do, and we did it a couple of times in here, is reference content that you need to get the job of imaging done. One piece that you always need is the boot image. The other piece that you always need is the image itself, the WIM file, and thirdly, the config manager client. Those three are common across every task sequence you will do. Right? Others can be optional, like applications, packages, whatever else you want to add in. It's fine. But those three are required all the time. Well, one of the things that's important for task sequence execution is for Config Manager to be able to find the content that it needs as a part of running that task sequence. And when you have a lot of different things on the task sequence, it can get maybe a little bit confusing to try to run all of them down. But and we won't even start the task sequence. If we start the task sequence and realize we cannot find a location for all of the content we need, we stop. The only exception to that, well, really not an exception, but the only difference to that is standalone media, where everything is self-contained. Then we really don't need to locate the content on the network. It's all within the media, and we have it. Right? Okay. So, but an easy way to sort this out is this tab down here called References. So references will show you all of the different components that you need, content components, that you need for the task sequence and whether we are in compliance with that, meaning that we have it available on a distribution point that we can pull from, right? And here we're good, so no problem. All right, so whenever we look at the task sequence itself, there are the properties of the task sequence, and then there's edit. If we want to just look at the overall properties of the task sequence, look at maybe some progress notification text, whatever, we can do that here. Look at the boot image, be able to change the boot image, set maximum allowed runtime, all of these things, run another program dependency first, whatever. We can do all of that on the property screen. If we want to look at the task sequence itself, then we do that on the edit screen. So here is a very basic task sequence to get the job of image deployment done. There's nothing special about this. It is bare bones. It will deploy the Windows 8 WIM that we told it to deploy, but it will do so in a very simplistic way. And that's fine. If that's where we start, everyone starts there. As we roll along through some of the discussions, we'll find that there's a lot of potential to customize the task sequence to do some really cool things. I like to think of task sequencing kind of as an onion. When you see the onion, you see what the onion's about, you know it's an onion, everything's good. But as you start to pull back the layers of the onion, you realize there's a lot more detail inside that onion, many layers of things that you need to pull through to get to the root of it. Same thing with task sequencing. You look at the task sequence, it is the engine for imaging. You can do imaging very basically, get it out there, no problem. But as you dig into what's possible with the task sequence, you start to realize there's a lot of layers to this and a lot of potential that you can bring to bear to really deliver a custom, very focused image solution. All right, so that said, let's walk through the process of this task sequence. And the first thing I always tend to start with, and I can't do it in this video, ask the question, but I always ask the question, look at the list of tasks in this sequence and tell me, where do we start the process in this task sequence? What's the first thing we do? And that seems like a trick question. It kind of is, but it's to try to get you thinking about what we do and where we do it and how the flow works and things like that, right? Well, in this case, the answer often is given, and it's right, that we start in the capture files and settings. And then I ask, well, what's the next thing that we do? And folks will continue on, well, this is the next thing we do. Yes, that's correct. Well, what's the next thing after that? And they'll say this, and they're getting a little bit confused about why I'm asking this at this point. And then I'll ask them one more time, what's next? Almost all the time, people say the next thing is install operating system. And visually, that's true. Conceptually in the flow, that's not true, right? So all of these are groups. Inside these groups, there are task sequence steps that need to run. So what happens within a group is we will start off, determine if we need to run this group or not, which we'll talk about in a minute. Go to the first step, run it based on the return code, either bail the task sequence or continue. Get done with this. Assuming we're good or even not, once we get complete with this step, we return control up here. And then once control's returned up here, now we go down here and loop through all of these steps. And once we get here, we return control up here and then come down here, here, return control back up, and there's no more steps, and so we exit. Right? That's how it works. The reason I tell you that is because understanding the flow of the task sequence is really vital to introducing some of the more sophisticated logic that we'll talk about in a little bit, and also vital for troubleshooting, right, as we get into that. All right, so let's start back at the top and kind of walk through what happens to get the process of imaging done. So we're going to start in this step. Well, another question that I ask when I talk about this live is, this section is called Capture Files and Settings. What does that name imply? The name implies that we're going to capture files and settings from a running OS. You can't really capture files and settings. Well, you might think about possibly doing it, but you cannot capture files and settings from Windows PE. You have to be in the running OS to do this, right? So the implication is this is started from within a running session of Windows, so a deployment-based image, perhaps, right? How do we know that? We know that because if we look under options, a better way to ask that question. So this task sequence can run equally whether we boot bare metal or whether we run from a deployment. So how do we know to ignore the capture files and settings piece when we run from Windows PE, when we do a bare metal boot? Because we're going to process this all the time, whether it's bare metal boot or running a deployment, right, to a running OS. The answer is options. So under options, and this is starting to talk about a little bit of the logical control that we can get with task sequencing, which we're not going to talk about a lot today. I'll show a few things to you. We'll talk about it in the next session, or a session to come, might not be the next one. We have a bunch of conditions. One of the condition types is task sequence variable. So the condition in order to enter this step or this group is that the internal variable called SMSTS in WinPE is equal to false. That's a little bit of a kind of a backwards way to think about it, but this variable is basically saying if this variable is true, that means that we are running in Windows PE. Therefore, we have no ability to do any kind of capture of settings, right? But if we're false, meaning that we're not in Windows PE, then the only other option is the running OS. And there we have the ability to capture settings, user state, which I'm not collecting here, or just basic network and Windows settings. So we will run this step, right? So if I'm bare metal booting, we just skip over this entire group because of this variable. But if I'm not, then we'll go through and we will process capture Windows settings. Here we have options. We migrate the computer name, migrate the registered user, migrate time zone, if you choose to, right? This only, again, makes sense if you're starting within a running OS. There is no computer name. Well, there is, but there's no computer name you want to migrate if you're doing bare metal. PE has a kind of an oddball computer name. So if you want to preserve the computer name, which if you're migrating from systems and starting in a running OS, very often you do, then you can do that, right? Capture network settings is a piece that will, again, if you're in a domain or you're in a work group, we can migrate that information for you. We can migrate your NIC settings for you if you would like. Right? By default, the domain and work group membership migration is turned off. So once we complete this, so assuming we're starting in a running OS, we complete this, return control up here. Now it's time to install the operating system. You'll notice there are no conditionals here because whether you're booting or initially running this thing from bare metal and booting directly into PE, or you're initiating this thing from a running OS, the goal is to image. So we're not going to prevent anyone from getting into the install operating system group. But the first step here is to restart in Windows PE. Well, if you're already in Windows PE, if you're doing a bare metal boot, there's no reason to do this step. If you're coming from a running OS, there is a reason to do this step because we need to get to Windows PE. Thus, we have an option again, the same variable. If we are not currently running in PE, then we need to restart into Windows PE. Here's the restart step. And one thing you'll notice is the names of these steps you can customize. Makes sense because these steps can be used to do a lot of things. Basically, this is the restart computer task, which we'll look at in the list in just a minute. With this task, you can reboot into Windows PE, the boot image associated to the task sequence, or you can just reboot into the currently installed operating system. Basically, task sequences handle reboots for you, no problem. So we're focused on task sequencing for operating system deployment. If you're doing an operating system deployment, install an application as part of the image that needs a reboot to take effect, install some software updates that needs a reboot, install a registry key or whatever that needs a reboot, that's great. Just infuse a reboot into the task sequence. We'll reboot, pick right back up where we left off and keep running. Right? No problem. It works out really well. So you can have multiple reboots during the imaging process if you like, and it's fine. It's just a choice of how you want to do it. Okay. Next, we get into the disk partitioning step. Right? Format and partition disk is the name. You notice that we have a couple. We have one for BIOS, one for UEFI. And you notice how the partitions by default are carved up. Right? For UEFI, a couple of different ones. For BIOS, just two. Here's a good point to call out. Right? So we talked about how really the imaging process doesn't do anything special except kind of make this unified with ConfigMgr, make it a UI that allows you to have a little bit easier time doing this, automating the tools in the ADK and such. This is a good example. All this is doing is leveraging disk part, which is part of the ADK, to get in and format and partition your disks, right? There's no requirement that you use our step in the task sequence to do that. You could call a script if you wanted to and do disk part yourself. Sometimes that is warranted, sometimes not, but it's here if you want to use it, and most people do, right? Another thing about this, notice the internals of this. So if I double click on one of these, you'll see the details, and you can configure the disk a number of different ways. You can configure the file system on it and such. This is an option in 2012 that is selected by default, quick format. It is not selected by default in 2007, and so if for some reason you're still imaging in 2007, make sure this is checked. Otherwise, a significant amount of time will be spent during the imaging process simply formatting the disks, right? Okay. One interesting scenario here, just as a brief look forward as to what's possible here. One of the customers that I work with uses OSD to partition the drives on server systems that could be different. So different models of servers, for example, might have a couple of 400 gigabyte disks, and then another model of servers might have 100 gigabyte disks and whatever, and then terabyte disks or whatever. And the formatting and partitioning is done differently based on the kind of disks in the system, right? So in their case, before they do the call to disk part, they will go query WMI to find out details about the disks, and then run disk part with the appropriate parameters to carve up the disk the right way. They do all that in script. That's fine. Again, there's no requirement that you use our disk partitioning step. If you're wanting to do something custom like that and be flexible to use script to detect these things, that's fine. No problem at all, right? But this is where all administrators tend to start. You can even set variables within this step if you want to. Variables is not something we'll talk about today. You've seen one already. You'll see maybe a couple more as you go along, but it's something we'll talk about in future sessions. Okay. And then the UEFI part is just the same. It's just carving up the disk a little bit differently. Apply OS is where we're going to apply the operating system. So we have apply operating system from captured image. That's what we have over here. Or you can actually apply the operating system from original installation source, which is what we have over here. Right? This is typically used, though it doesn't have to be, it's typically used in a build and capture, at least historically, build and capture type task sequence. You can do it this way in a build and capture, frankly, if you want to. You can do it this way in an installation task sequence if you wanted to, but this is the way it's typically done. All right. Use an unintended sysprep, so you can choose to add a sysprep in to the base image whenever you load it and process it through, no problem. The destination for the image, whenever you load it, by default is the next available formatted partition. Well, let's think about that, because here we have only one image inside our WIM. It is the Windows 8 installation. Well, if we go with this setting and look back at how our BIOS partitioning is done, you'll see that the first partition on the system is a 350 megabyte partition. Same with here. We have a couple of small partitions first, right? 300 megabyte. So if we go with this default configuration, we're going to take this really large WIM and try to load it onto a 350 megabyte partition, which will fail, right? So you have to understand what your task sequence is doing, and I like to actually control specifically what the task sequence is going to do and specify the disk, so disk 0, and what partition, partition 2. So we would skip over the 350 megabyte partition and lay the WIM down onto the larger one where it's supposed to be, right? Again, number of ways you could do this and a number of scenarios where you might carve it up differently, but at least that gives you an idea. Apply Windows settings. So if you're not capturing any Windows settings, there's really not a lot to apply, although you can have the administrator and server licensing and that kind of thing. Specify details about the password generation. This is what we configured in the wizard and the time zone. Apply network settings specifies workgroup or domain, and any kind of adapters to use DHCP by default, that kind of thing. And then finally, apply device drivers. So the idea of imaging is to be able to bring your system up totally ready to run from the very beginning, boot. Right? In order to do that, you need to have a library of device drivers that are out there so that the video card has the right driver, the NIC has the right driver, the whatever has the right driver installed and ready to go. There's a few ways that you can go about dealing with drivers. There's 3 ways actually you can do it. And depending on the scenario, really depends on which one you'll choose. We're going to have a session devoted to driver management, so I won't cover it more than just showing it to you here. Right? But know that driver management is a really important piece of this in order to have a seamless experience by the end user and reduce your help desk calls to get the right driver installed. Right? Now, here's also a good place to kind of walk through how this task sequence works, meaning we know a portion of this task sequence is going to run inside Windows PE. We also know a portion of this task sequence is going to reboot into the operating system that has been deployed. The question is, where does that happen? Well, if you look at the task sequence, assuming that you're starting in a bare metal config, you're booting directly into Windows PE. So none of this part up actually gets executed. We start here. All of this work, from apply device drivers up to partition disk 0, all of this is done inside Windows PE, right? If you're starting in a running OS, then we'll start up here, run through, restart in Windows PE, and then we'll continue in Windows PE this part through this part, right? Well, then we have everything installed. It's time to reboot into the operating system, and you do not see a step here to reboot, which is a bit mystifying. But understand, this setup Windows and ConfigMgr is doing that thing. It's setting up Windows and it's setting up ConfigMgr. As part of this step, we will reboot from Windows PE to the running OS. It's not stated here, but we do, right? So this is where that transition happens. Why do you need to know that? Because as we get more advanced in task sequencing, there will be times that we will add custom steps. And having those custom steps added in the right place is really, really important. Right? Some things are appropriate to do inside Windows PE. We'll see examples of what those things are in just a minute. Right? And there's several potential things that you could do inside Windows PE. For example, I'll just go ahead and mention a couple of them. In the MDT edition, which you'll see as I walk through some of the task sequence steps, there's a couple of tasks that will do work offline. Offline means while the Windows system that we're imaging is not running, meaning in Windows PE. So there's steps that will inject drivers. There's a step that will inject language packs. There's other things that you could do custom using the ADK tools to adjust the image offline before it ever boots. Obviously, those need to be done in Windows PE. Other things like installing applications or packages or whatever, those need to be done in the running OS, right? So knowing where that line changes, where that split happens, is really, really important, and that's where it takes place. All right, so with just this is a very plain Jane vanilla task sequence that will very completely do the job of imaging a system with the Windows 8 image, right? All right. So that's where we'll leave it. We'll actually pick up next time, and we'll install, using a couple of different install methods, a task sequence, an image with a task sequence very similar to this. Right? We might even use the same one. It just depends on if I remember to keep this around. So we'll see. All of these steps come from this menu. So here in this menu, we have the ability to add new groups. These are groups, right? The groups really help you nest steps and allow you decision control. So I showed you this logical, these kinds of things that you can add in for logic. There's task sequence variables, logical control, querying WMI, all these things that you can leverage. We'll talk about later. But these things allow you to have control over different execution pathways depending on conditions, right? Okay, so these various steps are the ones that you can leverage whenever you are imaging. Whenever you're imaging, right? So all of these are default except the ones that start with IBM and Dell. Ignore those for now. These come as part of some of the vendor-supplied toolkits to allow you to configure hardware and different things that I've got installed. So just ignore all of these. I'll hit pretty much most of these on the list except for the IBM and Dell ones to talk about them. I'm just going to add this. Don't pay attention to the place in which I add it. My cursor just happens to be there, so it's going to add there. Doesn't mean that it needs to add there. It just happens to be where it's being added, so I can talk about it, right? So this is a run command line step, which does exactly what the name implies. It runs a command line at this stage, right? So it could be running a directory command. It could be anything you want to do on the command line, running a batch script, running whatever, right? The point is that there are a couple of things to consider with this step. So specifically, notice, well, first of all, here's the command line entry. Assuming you're running like a command prompt command, you're going to preface the command with cmd.exe. And then you'll need a /c, and then you can specify whatever your command is. Right? The /c basically tells the command prompt, after you're done executing this, close the command prompt so that we don't just keep a lot of command prompts open that get in the way of the task sequence. Right? Then there's a couple of choices as to what you do here in terms of where your command that you're executing is located. If it's on the local system, no big deal. You can run a directory or a whatever command that you want to run on the local system. No problem, just from here. But there could be, one customer I was working with had a number of scripts that they wanted to be able to access and leverage throughout different parts of the task sequence. And they put all of those scripts in one package, so there were something like 50 of them, and just simply called those scripts out of the package when they needed them in the task sequence. That's fine. You can specify a package, and that will be the directory that we pull the different commands out of whenever we try to execute the command line. There's some 64-bit redirection stuff here as well. But then this, right? So this is really cool. So the run command line step is the only place where you have the ability to specify credentials of another user. And it's very useful for that reason. So whenever you run the task sequence, all of the processing of the task sequence is done in the context of the local system, right? That's why, well, let me explain that a little bit. So all of the commands that you run are run in the context of the local system. The exception to that is whenever you specify run command line with a user account, right? Then we'll execute that under the credentials that you supply. Works fine most of the time. Sometimes you'll run into a bit of an issue with it, but most of the time it works, right? Let me make sure that I clarify one thing. So I said everything that we do inside the task sequence is run under the context of the local system, and that is true. There are times, though, that we will need to go acquire content across the network and download packages and things like that. The local system account does not have rights to be able to do that. So we need another way to gain access to, or it doesn't have rights by default. You can certainly give it rights. We need another way to be able to access the network. So there's an account called the Network Access Account. Let me quickly show it to you. So if you go under Site Communications and Sites, you can go click on the site server, Settings, Configure Site Component, Software Distribution. There's this thing called the Network Access Account. The Network Access Account is specifically used when OSD needs to make a connection to a network share to download content, right? As long as that Network Access Account has rights to that share, which it will to all of the ConfigMgr shares by default because we know about it, then you can get that content downloaded. You could, I guess, give the Network Access Account rights to other shares external to the ConfigMgr shares if you chose to, right? But I wanted to show you that because someone could think, oh wait, the Network Access Account is what runs certain steps in the task sequence. That's not true. System account or the account you specify in a run as account are the only accounts that actually execute the steps. But if we need to retrieve content, we can use the Network Access Account if we need to, right? Okay. So that's run command line. Now, there's several more in here. Drop down here, run PowerShell script. So now we have the ability to have a PowerShell script in a package, tell it the script name, tell it all the parameters that you need, and you can configure the PowerShell execution policy for the script right here. All right, very cool. Add another one here. Set dynamic variables we'll wait on. That's a recent addition in R2 that kind of works the same as one of the MDT pieces. So we'll save that. Install application. So you saw in the wizard this option to install applications. And this is the step that it would use. So here you can choose to install one or multiple applications. Just browse to the application. It'll pop it up. You can pick whichever one or ones that you want. We'll go through at this step and we'll install those applications. Right? If you have multiple in the list, 10 applications, and application number 3 fails, then we'll fail the list unless you set this flag. Right? And then we have this option, install applications using a dynamic variable list. So I'll talk about this when we get to packages, but it exists both here and packages. Right? So we're getting to packages next. So there's also an install package step that does not allow you to configure multiple packages. So if you're going to use just the package designation and program designation from the drop-downs or from the browse menu, you'll have to have one install package step for every package you want to install. Right? But there's also this thing called the dynamic variable list right here. What is this thing? Right? And you see the same flag that highlights if something fails, go ahead and keep processing. Right? That applies here as well. So what is this dynamic variables list? Well, we'll talk about this a bit more whenever we get into variables and that kind of thing, but in a very generic way, I'll describe it this way. A dynamic variables list basically allows you to take a variable and associate it with a number of applications or packages in a collection. Let me say it differently. So a dynamic variable allows you to define, choose a variable, and in that variable and subsequent variables that chronologically follow that variable, define an association with the package and program or with an application. And then you define those variables on either the computer object directly or the collection. And then when we get to the step, we'll go through those variables and work through everything you tell us to work through all in one step. Right? I'll show this to you later, but that's what it is. It's a way to shortcut this and allow you to just do a lot of processing within one step. Okay? All right. So let's keep rolling. Under General, we also have install software updates. So this, again, in the wizard, whenever we went through creating the task sequence, one of the things it asked is, do you want to install software updates? I said no. This is the step that it would have added if I would have said yes. So this step works great. I don't care for this step as a preferred way to install software updates. Not that it doesn't work, it works fine. The reason I don't prefer it is because this step requires the system that you've just imaged to be booted into the running OS and the ConfigMgr client loaded to a point that we can access the infrastructure and pull down software updates. Right? Well, that's cool and it works well, and it's very much what the ConfigMgr client does just regularly whenever we deploy software updates. The challenge with it, though, is whenever you deploy an image, there is a good likelihood that that image is missing some software updates that it needs to be fully patched. So while that system is online and not fully patched, it's vulnerable. The degree of vulnerability depends, but it's vulnerable. So I would far prefer to be able to load the patches in Windows PE before the system ever boots into that running OS so that I know it's fully patched from the very beginning. That's my preference. A lot of people use this. It works great, but I prefer to do it all offline, which I'll show you how to do that in a step in a minute. Just because of the extra security that it brings. There's also a uniqueness about that step, the install software updates offline step, which I'll show you in a bit, that some people don't prefer. But either way, it's your choice just to walk through the options. Another one here. So install software updates. Now we have join domain or work group. That's pretty self-explanatory. So the ones that are fairly self-explanatory, I won't show the detail. This one's pretty self-explanatory. Connect to network folder. So this one it allows you to basically do a net use, but from this GUI. So you might be tempted just to run a command line and do a net use, and in portions of the task sequence that will work. In portions of the task sequence you will have problems. So especially in Windows PE, I've had some interesting challenges that I don't have if I use the step here to connect to the network folder. Right. So just bear that in mind. Not a bad thing to have in here, just so we can see what you're doing a little bit better, maybe than in a script or whatever. Right. But that's all it does. It does a net use, connects to the folder, lets you supply credentials, and so on. All right. Also, in general, we have the ability to restart the computer. We've seen that. Set task sequence variables. We won't talk about that in this session. Check readiness. Also, we won't talk about in this session. It's really, again, one of the pieces added in R2. That's kind of an MDT pullover into ConfigMgr OSD. Well, I'll show it to you. Basically, it allows you to check the readiness of the machine, processor speed, minimum memory, that kind of thing. Things that you would oftentimes do with a collection, but you could do it in the task sequence just as well as an extra check to make sure. Right? All right, so out of general into disks. So just to run through these, I'm not going to show them to you. You can format and partition the disk. We've seen that step already. Convert to dynamic. Enable, disable, provision BitLocker, all here if you choose to use BitLocker. User state. We'll have a session on user state, but this is how we'll use the default steps anyway. Again, you don't have to use our default steps. You can do your own custom steps with USMT, but using our default steps, capture and then restore the user state. Images. So these are the steps we use to apply our operating system image, which is what we saw. If you just want to apply a data image like for a non-boot disk, like D drive or whatever, you could do that. The setup Windows and ConfigMgr step you saw. Install deployment tools is an MDT kind of thing, as I recall. I think that's right. Yeah, sysprep package. That's what it is. Yeah, for systems that don't have sysprep, right? Then we have just the capture steps. So we did the capture in session 2. These are the steps we leveraged. Right? Drivers, a complete section on drivers. We'll talk about this independently, but these are a couple of the options for installing drivers. And then finally, settings. So this is where we do our capture and apply of our network and Windows settings. The very last section is MDT. So here, MDT is its own addition, and we'll talk about MDT in a separate session. But just to show you, when you integrate ConfigMgr with or integrate MDT into ConfigMgr, you get these steps. And there's a couple of things you get. You actually get a couple of task sequence wizards again. We'll look at MDT later, but you definitely get a few task sequence step additions. So you'll see the use toolkit package and gather and validate. Anyone familiar with MDT understands what these are. But then you get some really cool things like install language pack offline, install language pack online. Right? Offline is where we actually install it during Windows PE. The steps look the same. All we're doing is pointing to a language pack package in either one. Right? They look exactly the same. They just do their work in either the running OS in the online case or in Windows PE in the offline case. Then we have the run PowerShell script, which we have one of these baked into ConfigMgr as well. We have this one, which is really cool, execute runbook. So in MDT, we have the ability to call over into an orchestrator server to initiate a runbook from a task sequence. That offers a lot of possibilities that you wouldn't have without it, right? One of the things people have asked for a long time is, can you call a task sequence from within a task sequence? The answer is no. But it's kind of yes now, because essentially a runbook is very task sequence-like. So you can have a section in your task sequence that reaches out to orchestrator and initiates a runbook to do some configuration work or whatever you want that runbook to do. We'll talk about some of that integration in later sessions, how that works, right? Okay. Other MDT steps would be install roles and features, uninstall roles and features. So these would be the operating system roles and features for servers or workstations or whatever you want to add in, right? Then finally, we can configure Active Directory domain services, DNS, DHCP, all of those things, right, through MDT add-on, which is really nice. And then finally, the last step MDT provides is this thing called install updates offline. So this goes back to our software update discussion. Where do you install the updates, either in the running OS or in the Windows PE stage? And I really prefer the Windows PE stage for the reasons cited. The only thing you have to do in this step is tell us where the updates are that you want us to install. We'll run through those updates, try to install them, install the ones we need to, and then move on, right? Only thing that's unique about this is we need to specify a package that contains our updates. This is not a deployment package like you might expect that it would be. This is just a standard configuration manager package, very much like the config manager client package or the USMT package or whatever, right? So you would need to maintain a separate package with all of the updates that you want to run through in this step. Again, so you can make the decision which one you want to use, but it's an interesting option to make sure that system is fully patched when it comes online. Another option, frankly, to minimize exposure to image systems is simply to keep the image updated. So let me just remind you where that is real quick. So if I go to the image, a routine part of maintenance might be to schedule software updates that I want to inject into the image. The system does it for you automatically. It just works on it. So maybe it's a once a month or once every 2 month kind of thing that you update the base WIM, and that way it maybe is not such a big deal that you're online on the network for a few minutes unpatched, right? It's up to you, but those are the options. So that really wraps up what I wanted to talk about today. Again, understanding the task sequence is really important. It is the main thing, the main engine that drives the entire imaging process. So we'll want to spend some time on that, go through the steps. We'll talk about the task sequence more in a future session, specifically the logic and how you can start to think about maybe expanding the flexibility of the task sequence and things. But we'll do that in another session. Next time we get together, we will talk about how we take this basic image or this basic task sequence we created and deploy it in different scenarios. So the different scenarios would be, bare metal or standalone or deployment based or PXE booting, that kind of thing. So we'll talk about those in the next session, and we'll see you then.